Hi, everybody. I am Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard. Welcome to our Dr. Class Tuesday webinar. Today's title is States of Extraction, the Emergence of Indigenous Rights in Latin America. As always, let me introduce you to my amazing co-chair, Francis Agopian.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
I also want to thank our Crack Dr. Class team of Paula Ibarra and Jillian Scales, who make this thing run every week. Before we begin, let me remind you, we've got English-Spanish translation. So if you want to hear the talk in Spanish, just go to the, actually we have Portuguese interpretation too, right? So if you want to hear in Portuguese or Spanish, go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. As always, we'll be recording the webinar today and it'll be available shortly afterwards on the Dr. Class YouTube channel. And third, importantly, if you have questions for our speaker today, we would love to receive them. We just don't want to receive them, we can't receive them through the chat button. Send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Fran and I will be taking questions and feeding them to Chris after his presentation. So if you have a question for Chris at any point during the presentation, just send it on through the Q&A function and we will make every effort to pass it on. Okay, let me introduce our speaker today. We've got an old-fashioned single speaker, no panel, no discussants, no nothing. It's all on Chris. Chris Carter is an Academy Scholar here at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. He's also about to become Assistant Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. Chris is a proud card-carrying member of the Berkeley Mafia, PhD in Political Science from UC Berkeley in 2020. His book project, about which he is speaking today, examines the emergence of indigenous and individual rights in Latin America. That project won the 2021 Juan Linz Prize for Best Dissertation in the Comparative Study of Democracy. It has also produced several important publications, including articles in the journals Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, Perspectives on Politics, and Party Politics. Chris, I should say, is a bit of a puzzle because, you know, on the one hand, he is a member of the Berkeley Mafia, which gets him a lot of points, at least in these parts. On the other hand, he's an Atlanta Braves fan. So I don't know what to do with that. But I should say that I have had the great pleasure of getting to know Chris and his work over the last couple of years here at Harvard. And I thought I knew some things about indigenous politics and indigenous rights and where they come from and who fought for them and why, and it turns out it's a lot more complicated than I thought. And Chris has taught me so much about the origins of the push for indigenous rights and really led a lot of us to rethink how we understand indigenous politics. So don't turn off your screen. This is a terrific topic and a terrific speaker. So Chris Carter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to you and Fran and everyone else for the invite and for Paula for helping organize and then for the translators too. I think that's fantastic. So today I'll be speaking on research from my book project, States of Extraction, the Emergence of Indigenous Rights in Latin America. In 2005, Bolivia, a majority indigenous country, elected its first indigenous president, Evo Morales. In 2006, Morales, in his inaugural address, invoked the Aymara indigenous language to claim that the Achuru, or the Great Day for indigenous people, has finally arrived. In 2009, Morales appeared to deliver on this promise by promoting a new constitution that would expand indigenous rights for the country's indigenous population. We can think of indigenous rights as group-based ethnic entitlements to longstanding political and economic institutions. These rights are group-based in the sense that a group holds the right rather than an individual, and they're ethnic in the sense that these rights are only available to members of indigenous groups and not more generally available to non-indigenous peoples. Scholars often argue that indigenous rights are the central demand of indigenous movements and organizations. Yet despite this commonly held idea, individual indigenous communities, of which there may be hundreds or even thousands in a given country, haven't uniformly embraced indigenous rights. Returning to the case of Bolivia, of the 235 municipalities that were eligible for indigenous rights under the 2009 Constitution, eligibility in this case means majority indigenous. So far, only 30 municipalities have started the process for adopting indigenous rights, and just 3 have fully adopted these rights. Throughout the Americas, we can see a similar uneven embrace of indigenous rights by indigenous communities. In Mexico, 15% of municipalities in Oaxaca chose not to pursue indigenous rights under a 1995 electoral reform. In the United States, a third of native reservations rejected indigenous rights under the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. And in Peru, 30% of indigenous communities have chosen not to pursue indigenous rights. And this raises a couple of key puzzles. First, when do indigenous groups demand government recognition of their indigenous rights? And second, when are other rights either instead or also demanded? And my book argues that historical experiences with extraction can play a key role in determining the later demands that indigenous communities make. I focus on 2 broad types of extraction, that perpetrated by the state and that perpetrated by rural elites. And within those categories, I focus specifically on 2 forms of extraction. The first is the conscription of indigenous labor for government infrastructure projects like roads and railways. And the second is the seizure of indigenous land by large landowners or hacendados. The conventional wisdom suggests that extraction shapes indigenous groups' economic welfare. My book argues that extraction can also shape indigenous groups' political behavior. Specifically, I argue that experiences with state-led extraction often increase demands for indigenous rights, whereas rural elite extraction often increases demands for what I call peasant rights. And importantly, both of these rights might be demanded at the same time if both forms of extraction are experienced. The evidence in my book project draws on a multi-method research strategy. I draw first on archival data on extraction and indigenous community mobilization, especially in Peru, but also in Bolivia. I also draw on 18 months of fieldwork that I conducted in Peru and Bolivia using interviews with community leaders, as well as participant observation in community meetings. I also supplement this with a survey of 300 indigenous community presidents in Cusco, as well as a survey of 2,000 indigenous respondents in Bolivia. Prior to outlining my theoretical framework and analyzing my empirical examples, I first want to provide a sense of what indigenous rights are. So as I said earlier, indigenous rights can be thought of as group-based ethnic entitlements to longstanding political and economic institutions. Examples of indigenous rights include political autonomy or self-governance, education in indigenous languages, which can involve indigenous language schools or bilingual education in indigenous communities, and finally, communal landholding, in which indigenous communities' collective right to landholding is recognized. The primary indigenous right that I examine in my book is communal land. And I consider this to be if not the fundamental indigenous right. And this is because communal land shapes a number of important aspects of indigenous communal life. First, communal land is an economic right. Because communal land is inalienable and indivisible, it cannot be treated as an economic asset that could be bought or sold. Communal land also has a fundamentally political component. The indivisibility and inalienability of this communal land creates an enduring territorial space over which authority can be exercised. Furthermore, when land isn't held by individuals, but rather by a collective community, someone has to determine who has access to this land. In the case of indigenous communities, this is often the community leader. And this leads to a third important dimension that's affected by communal land, which is the social life of the community. Collectively held land often promotes the persistence of basic social institutions such as reciprocity, redistribution, and subsistence, which have long characterized traditional communities. And so indigenous communities can promote participation in these social institutions by removing community members' access to land if members refuse to participate in these institutions. Often indigenous communities are assumed in the literature to want communal land above all else, as depicted in this image from Peru, in which officials of the Peruvian state attempt to impose private property on indigenous communities who instead hold up a sign advocating for their communal land. However, indigenous communities haven't uniformly pursued communal land titles. In Peru, for example, almost 30% of communities don't have a communal title, and 38% of communities have at least some portion of their community that is managed as private land. So how do we explain these demands for variation in demands for indigenous rights, and in this case, communal land? Scholars have offered several candidate explanations for why we're more likely to see indigenous rights in some cases rather than others. Some argue that strong indigenous movements are a necessary condition for the emergence of indigenous rights. Others argue that pluricultural constitutions and peace agreements provide the opportunity space within which indigenous communities can demand indigenous rights. And still others argue that neoliberal and corporatist regimes are more amenable to the emergence of indigenous rights than the developmentalist regimes that we associate with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Evo Morales in Bolivia. Importantly, this work focuses on the national level emergence of indigenous rights, and in some cases, the regional emergence of indigenous rights. But rarely does this work consider why individual indigenous communities demand or do not demand indigenous rights. And I argue that this is a fairly major oversight in the literature, given the historical importance of indigenous communities in Latin America. So what are indigenous communities? I define them as geographically defined units that are similar in structure to a village. They tend to be located in remote and rural areas and were historically based around subsistence agriculture. Structurally, they're comprised of a community leader, or what I'll call an elite, and between 20 and 500 community members. One of the chief historical responsibilities of indigenous leaders has been to organize collective action within their communities. This can involve organizing unpaid labor to provide needed infrastructure projects for the community, or organizing self-defense brigade to defend the community against external threats. However, in the 20th century, there emerged a number of challenges to this authority. The first was that increased communication and infrastructure technologies allowed communities to begin integrating into markets for the first time. And as a result, community members had higher opportunity costs to engaging in collective action organized by indigenous leaders. Second, we see a continued expansion of large estates, or haciendas, that threaten to break up indigenous communities and therefore undermine the ability of indigenous leaders to organize collective action. And finally, we see the rise of rural sector unions, particularly in the mid-20th century, which provide an alternative form of mobilization that communities could engage in outside of that organized by the indigenous community leaders. So why were some indigenous community leaders better able to withstand these challenges to their authority than others? I argue that state-led labor conscription can play an important role in understanding exactly why some leaders maintained their collective action capacity while others lost it. Specifically, the threat of labor conscription generated a collective resistance from indigenous community leaders, which was often widespread. And often this took the form of explicitly ethnic rebellion to resist labor conscription by the state. Importantly, these effects didn't end once conscription ended. During the period of conscription, indigenous leaders invested in enduring local ethnic organizations that helped preserve mobilization around an ethnic identity over the long term. Indigenous leaders also assumed new titles during the period of conscription, such as coronel or cacique apoderado, which reflected and institutionalized their role as organizers of collective mobilization. Indigenous leaders have also played, over the course of the 20th century, an important role in maintaining ethnic mobilization by preserving the collective memory of conscription and the grievances associated with it, as well as the resistance to that conscription. For example, communities in one province that I visited in Peru held pilgrimages to work sites in order to commemorate their community's experiences with road conscription in the 1920s. These enduring investments in collective action helped preserve the power of Indigenous elites and allowed them to set the terms of their community demands, most notably for Indigenous rights, which both were viewed as a way of reinforcing communities and helping community members, as well as reinforcing the authority of community leaders. So when an opportunity space opened in the late 20th century, following democratization and the rise of international Indigenous movements, it was these leaders who were most effective at mobilizing their communities for Indigenous rights. And conversely, where conscription wasn't experienced, Indigenous leaders were more vulnerable to the aforementioned structural challenges of expanding unions, markets, and private estates that eroded their power and collective mobilization capacity, and therefore their ability to shape community demands. State-led labor conscription can thus help us understand why Indigenous rights emerged in some cases and not others, but what about other types of rights, such as class-based peasant rights? And these include shorter work days, better working conditions, higher pay, and importantly, private landholding. I argue that rural elite extraction plays a key role, and specifically the expansion of large estates or haciendas created a base that could be identified and then mobilized by rural sector unions. And specifically, rural sector unions targeted their mobilization efforts to areas that had large hacienda populations. As I show here through an original analysis of just over 800 Indigenous movements in Peru during the mid-20th century, there's a strong and positive correlation between the percentage of the rural population on haciendas and the percentage of movements that are organized by unions. Through either shaping the preferences of communities or simply reflecting the underlying preferences of mobilized groups, unions organized Indigenous communities around demands for peasant rights, which, as I said earlier, include better working conditions, shorter working days, and often private land titles. We can see here, for example, that there's a strong positive correlation between the percent of the rural population residing on haciendas and the proportion of movements that made demands for workers or as opposed to ethnic rights. Putting everything together then, when there was limited state-led conscription and land seizure by large estates, Indigenous elites were less likely to mobilize their communities, lacking both the collective action capacity to mobilize or a union that can mobilize communities in the absence of mobilization by Indigenous elites. Conversely, when we see state-led labor conscription but no land seizure by large estates, we're likely to see mobilization for Indigenous rights. However, given that there aren't likely to be unions, we're more likely to see leaders form grassroots Indigenous organizations to articulate demands for Indigenous rights. Where we see land seizures by large estates but no state-led labor conscription, we're most likely to observe mobilization for peasant rights through unions, and particularly rural sector unions. In these cases, Indigenous leaders have limited capacity to shape the demands of unions given limited collective action capacity, and therefore are more likely to be forced to accept mobilization for peasant rights rather than Indigenous rights. However, where both forms of extraction are experienced, Indigenous elites have relatively more power to shape the agenda of unions, and therefore we're more likely to see what I label fused demands for both peasant and Indigenous rights. So importantly, the theory that I set forth here isn't deterministic. There are, of course, other factors that can shape the mobilization capacity of Indigenous communities. These include geography and language. However, I think the theory that I'm outlining here illustrates a really important role of historical factors as one tool of explaining the mobilization strategies adopted by Indigenous communities. In my empirical examples that I'll present today, I'll focus on cases that experienced hacienda expansion, but varied in the levels of state-led labor conscription that they faced. I'll begin with an example from La Convención, a province in Peru, to explain how the expansion of large estates led to a mobilization for peasant rights through unions. So in 1958, a young Marxist descended upon the province of La Convención in the Peruvian department of Cusco, and preaching a message of land or death, he gained a quick following and soon became known as Peru's answer to Fidel Castro. This man, Hugo Blanco, gained a following among the indigenous communities in the province, particularly those that had been captured onto large estates. Between 1958 and 1963, Blanco organized peasants to seize dozens of large estates in the province, demanded that land be redistributed as private parcels to landless peasants. It's no coincidence that Blanco's movement arose in La Convención. The province had higher levels of hacienda expansion than any other in Peru, with more than 1/2 of the rural population residing on a large estate. The mobilization of indigenous Peruvians by Blanco and the newly formed Union of Peasant Communities resulted in an increase in demand for peasant rights. Most of these movements directly protested abuses by the large landowners that had taken over indigenous lands, and movements for land rights in the region demanded not communal property, but rather private land titles through a massive land redistribution. Under the leadership of Blanco, unions expanded throughout La Convención. Every hacienda was unionized, which secured improved protections for indigenous peasants whose labor was frequently exploited on large estates. Perhaps even more importantly, Blanco and his union members were able to stage a general strike, which resulted in the provincial government adopting a massive land reform. And this land reform would redistribute estate land in private parcels to peasants. So very different from the idea of communal property that's normally associated with indigenous rights, as I mentioned earlier. Importantly, this land reform adopted by the provincial government in La Convención would ultimately be the model for the nationwide land reform adopted by the Peruvian government in the second half of the 20th century. And so the example provided by Blanco shows that union leaders could play a key role in shaping how indigenous communities mobilized in areas where indigenous leaders were relatively weak. In these areas, indigenous communities were more likely to mobilize for exclusively peasant rights. And in the case of land reform, this involved the issuing of private property titles. Please forgive the horns in the background. I hope they're not too loud. So if we evaluate the La Convención strategy, we can see that it provides something of a trade-off for indigenous elites. On the one hand, it's a successful movement for rights that results in improved conditions for indigenous communities and those on large estates. On the other hand, the movement was primarily for peasant rights and specifically private land titles, which were not necessarily in the interests of indigenous elites. Of course, private land, in the same way that communal land titles reinforce the authority of indigenous leaders by providing a collective resource over which indigenous elites can distribute access, private land titles remove this and potentially divide communities from one another, as land can now be bought and sold. Furthermore, community leaders were often marginalized within the leadership structure of union organizations, particularly in cases like that of La Convención. So there's a clear trade-off here for indigenous elites. Now, I argue that this trade-off could be avoided if indigenous elites are able to lobby unions to include not just demands for peasant rights, but also for indigenous rights. And this is what I label fused demands, in which unions mobilize not only for peasant rights, but also for indigenous rights. And as I argued earlier, we're most likely to see the emergence of fused demands when communities experience both state-led labor conscription and hacienda expansion. To think of an example of these rights, we can turn to the Comité Central Pro Derecho Indígena Tahuantinsuyo, which was founded in 1917 and by the 1920s had developed strong ties to anarcho-syndicalist unions in Lima. And while this might be an indigenous organization, by the mid-1920s, scholars argue that it was operating much more like a traditional union. And the Comité importantly advocated for fused demands. It, on the one hand, argued for peasant rights, especially an 8-hour workday, but it also advocated for communal land titles rather than the redistribution of land as private property. In 1923, a union emerged from the Comité called the Federación Indígena Obrera Regional Peruana, which, quote, promoted a class and internationalist outlook, peasant worker solidarity, direct action, and ethnic pride. And like the Comité, it advocated strongly for communal land titles for peasants. Importantly, we see that this fused, the emergence of unions that espouse fused demands become especially strong in southern Peru, an area that had both a large hacienda population and extensive exposure to state-led labor conscription in the 1920s, which I argue in my book was a real critical juncture when thinking about the effects of labor conscription. So to summarize, historical extraction played a key role in shaping indigenous communities' long-term mobilization. State-led extraction, especially through labor conscription, generally increased communities' demands for indigenous rights, whereas experiences with rural elite extraction, particularly through hacienda expansion, increased the likelihood that communities demanded peasant rights, often through unions. A few additional observations that I address in my book, but haven't had time to address today, but I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A, are that sequencing can be really important. In this argument, I've sort of treated rural elite extraction and state-led extraction as independent of one another, but that's not, of course, always the case. In many instances, if communities had been captured onto haciendas, that actually allowed them to avoid later state-led extraction because hacienda owners were extremely protective of their labor, which prevented communities from being mobilized often for conscription projects. So these dimensions aren't necessarily independent, but rather deeply related to one another. And second, the degree to which peasant rights and indigenous rights conflict with one another depends crucially on the domain of analysis. There are certain peasant rights like private landholding, which are inherently conflictual with ideas of communal land that are characteristic of indigenous rights. However, other peasant rights aren't necessarily conflictive with indigenous rights. Better working conditions doesn't conflict with ideas of political autonomy, bilingual education, or communal landholding. And this is how we see the fusion of indigenous and peasant demands emerge around these rights that don't necessarily conflict with one another, but rather are compatible. There's several implications of the argument that I've highlighted today. First is that the embrace of indigenous and peasant rights has important implications for economic welfare and political inclusion, whereas peasant rights assumes the existence of a market economy and attempts to address its inefficiencies and its injustice. Indigenous rights challenge the market economy and the supremacy of the market economy and offer an alternative moral economy around which ideas of economic development can occur. Similarly, the decision to embrace indigenous versus peasant rights has important implications for political inclusion. Whereas indigenous rights reflect an accommodationist idea of how indigenous groups might be included into the nation state, peasant rights instead operate on more of an assimilationist framework, which is that ethnicity is often subordinated to class as a primary form of mobilization. Similarly, the different mobilizational strategies that groups adopt, whether through unions or indigenous organizations, can have highly different effects on the likelihood that policy actually is changed. In the mid-20th century, for example, unions were an incredibly effective tool for policy change because of their ties to corporatist and leftist governments. However, in more recent years, indigenous organizations, which sometimes have ties to international indigenous movements, have been more successful at generating policy change, even as unions continue to decline in political power in many parts of the Americas. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I hope that my argument illustrates the remarkable resilience of indigenous communities. I think in many cases, the assumption is that in response to extraction, we see the division and destruction of indigenous communities. However, I think what we can also see is that indigenous communities respond to extraction often by investing in their ability to resist it and to lobby for future rights. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Chris. So in 2 years, I still haven't really gotten down this role of taking in questions and feeding them to you. And you got all the questions in the last 25 seconds as you were closing. So my mind was a blur even before, and now it's even more of a pudding. But let me start with a couple of questions. Maybe the simplest way is to pick up on a question that Sarah Chartok asked, which is whether if you could spend a little more time discussing how the sort of longer term outcomes of your, so much of your stories in the first half of the 20th century, what, if anything, is it able to say to longer term outcomes in, say, the late 20th, early 21st century, which is the period that most of us, not Sarah, but most of us are focused on. Let me ask a second question on top of that, which is for you to say a little bit more about external actors. I was really struck by the role of Hugo Blanco, and I wasn't sure how he gets theorized. You don't say much about political parties. You talk a little bit about unions, but they're mostly local unions. But there are cases that in which national political parties seek to mobilize indigenous communities, where communist unions seek to mobilize indigenous communities, and sometimes individual actors. Like I'm not sure what exactly Hugo Blanco represents, but what role do parties and other national organizations have in shaping these demands and also shaping mobilizational capacity of indigenous communities? I'll leave you with those two, and then I'll hand to Fran, but we have a bunch of questions to get to you, to feed you in a second.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. These are really helpful comments and questions. So in terms of the longer term outcomes in the late 20th and 21st century, I think especially in the case of state-led labor conscription, we see that this initial sort of investment in collective mobilization capacity by indigenous leaders to resist labor conscription is then institutionalized through organization and institutions that then themselves change over time. So for example, the Tawantinsuyo Committee often formed local chapters of their organizations in places that had experienced state-led labor conscription. And though that committee eventually was dissolved and changed, but the structures that created the organizations and the networks that sort of underlined that organization persisted over time, such that even as new organizations emerged over the course of the 20th century, often different indigenous organizations, they were able to build on those networks that had been established in these areas in order to sort of continue across time. And what we see is that in the late 20th century, as there's more precedent for indigenous rights and demands for indigenous rights, as opposed to an environment that's basically only amenable to demands for peasant rights, we see that these organizations begin to sort of, which were almost latent before, begin to emerge to actually begin demanding indigenous rights, and often do so very effectively. So that's one answer to that question. I think with respect to unions, we see that union mobilization often occurs in the mid 20th century, not at the same time as indigenous organizations. So there are some rural sector unions that are active in the 1920s, but most emerge in the 1940s and 1950s, as you know, in order to begin to capitalize on this late sort of the hacienda population that has these exploitative relationships with landowners. And how does Hugo Blanco get theorized? Well, I think of him as a union leader. I mean, he did form a union that many indigenous, it's sort of in some ways an exceptional case, right? I mean, Hugo Blanco isn't indicative of broader union mobilization, but I think he is sort of useful in thinking of what dynamics I'm speaking to as sort of almost an extreme case. In terms of political parties, I think that, the way I'm thinking of it is, the real benefit of unions is that they serve as a useful linkage between these very local communities and national political parties, because unions, unlike indigenous organizations at the time, often have a structure that is more conducive to exercising influence at either the regional or the national level. So therefore, unions can be a way of linking indigenous groups to political parties. It's something that I'm trying to think of, if we think of sort of direct mobilization by APRA for non-electoral means, or the Peruvian Communist Party for non-electoral means, I think that's something I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it fits into my argument, and if there's a story in which there's direct mobilization that's sort of common enough, especially in this domain of demanding rights rather than just for an electoral goal, that's useful to theorize. It's something I'm still figuring out how it fits into the broader argument, but mostly it's about the intermediation between unions and parties rather than direct linkages between parties and communities.
Okay, Fran.
Okay, I like to think about myself as a little bit more competent than the director, but in this case, I feel exactly the same way. We keep getting really interesting questions or just getting dumped into the question and answer period, and I'm having a little bit of trouble pulling them together. But I think what I want to do in this round is ask a series of questions from the audience that all have to do with the question of time in your project. And people have questions about different time periods, but there's a number of questions that are related to time. So Anik Benavides asks and I had this question myself, what is time one? She's asking particularly about the contrast between the colonial period and the independent period. And she's wondering about whether colonial modes of labor conscription in regions with denser haciendas from the 16th to the 19th centuries, how, during this period, did rural inhabitants consider themselves indigenous? Were peasant interests born in the 20th century? So do we think about this as the confrontation with independent states, or was there any legacy from the colonial period? And of course, anyone who's read Melissa Dell's work has the same thoughts, thinking about labor conscription. And Angel Cabrera also is asking about time. And he's asking about whether more recent developments, I think he might have a couple of questions in here, because I'm thinking I've got different, no, maybe I'm just confused. No, there is, sorry, audience. So Angel is asking about whether the gradual institutionalization of indigenous claims in the state has created a different dynamic in more recent years. And he's specifically pointing to the Instituto Nacional de Pueblos Indígenas. The budget in Mexico creates special social programs and funds only for indigenous villages. Could this be a claim? Could this be an incentive to claim rights? Once rights are conceded, does this in itself become an incentive for communities to claim rights? Your opening was a teaser. Your opening tells us, well, just because they offered this opportunity doesn't mean they're going to take it up, but we'd still like to know about it. And Zaray Toledos Orozco asked, this is one other question that I noted that was about time, asks about why you identified the period of hacienda expansion as a critical juncture. What about episodes where indigenous descendants and allies became leaders of political transformations like the Bolivian Revolution in 1952? Or in episodes where indigenous peoples were displaced. For example, when Sendero, the presence of Sendero in Peru. Or even the Aymara groups in Bolivia after the Chaco War were able to develop political ideologies. So what is time? How sticky is time? You know, when Steve introduced you as a member of the Berkeley Mafia, and when language like critical junctures comes up, those of us who are not from Berkeley, you know, our antenna go up. So what is going on with time? I guess I'm going to stick in one more thing about time. Do any initial failures or success in scoring land reform shape the nature of the demands that get formed? Your story about Peru and Bolivia are actually two cases. As horrific as labor conditions were in rural areas, they're actually two places where land reform happens pretty early. That's not the case in a lot of the rest of Latin America. So I guess I'll just tack that on. So tell us about time, and then we'll have time for more rounds of questions. But these questions are specifically about time.
Well, thank you to Fran and the audience for these wonderful questions. So I want to start quickly with the point that you raised, Fran, last, that, you know, do the initial failures or successes shape the demands that are made? It's it's an interesting question that I would like to deal more with. I mean, not just the land reform in Peru under the military government, but also the idea that communal land titles are first recognized in 1920 under the same government, Augusto Leguía, that perpetrates the worst period, arguably, of state-led labor conscription in Peruvian history. And the idea that even despite offering, at this point, communities in Peru are called Indian communities, it's only later under the military government that they're renamed peasant communities in some ways. So the idea of communal land and titles for communities is an indigenous right. It's sort of interesting that we don't see, you know, sort of the robust demands for indigenous rights, particularly at the national level in Peru, that we see in some other cases, given that there was this early precedent for the recognition of indigenous rights. So I do think that that's a particularly interesting question that I need to do more to deal a little bit more with in the book, because I think there's a lot of fascinating questions around it. In terms of what is time one, this is another question that I struggle a lot with. The reason that I'm focused primarily on dynamics that begin post sort of 1870, roughly, is because this is the period after which we begin to see sort of nominally liberal governments beginning these sort of programs throughout the Americas, not just Latin America, but the United States as well, to take away indigenous rights and indigenous lands and systematically attack them. And it's no coincidence that that coincides with the elimination of the Indian tribute in Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru. Because previously there had been these sort of tributary pacts where governments would continue to recognize basic indigenous rights, both communal land and political authority, in exchange for indigenous communities continuing to pay a tribute to the government. Now, once those are removed, the government loses all incentives to protect indigenous rights. So I think that this marks, therefore, a different point in history. I think the tributary period, both in the colonial and immediate post-independence period, in the cases I'm studying, was so different that basically, you know, it's not a clean slate at all, but it's a fundamentally different period that begins in the 1870s. However, I do think, you know, thinking about the role of labor conscription in the colonial period, we do see pretty similar effects in some ways. I mean, Melissa Dell notes that where there was labor conscription, there was a higher persistence of indigenous communities relative to haciendas, which is consistent with the argument I'm making. But the one thing that I think is really different about the Mita compared to the, you know, case of labor conscription between 1870 and 1930 in Peru, Mexico, Bolivia, is that, and Ecuador, is that in the early sort of the turn of the 20th century, we don't see indigenous elites actively incorporated into the process of conscription in the same way that they often were during the period of the Mita. So one of Dell's sort of side comments in her paper is that, indigenous elites were empowered through the Mita because they were the ones that were responsible for mobilizing the labor of their communities. And that simply wasn't the case in any of the contexts I'm studying. So I think that generates really different dynamics and different incentives to resist conscription that we don't necessarily see in the colonial period, where elites were more likely to be co-opted into conscription. And this idea of the gradual sort of institutionalization of indigenous rights and increasing incentives to seek indigenous rights for sort of more strategic reasons because there are benefits to it. I think we certainly see this not just in Latin America, but throughout the world. I mean, for the first time, there are communities in sub-Saharan Africa that are claiming indigenous status, which has never been done before, in order to try to obtain rights through the international discourse that's been developed around sort of legitimate claims to rights. Claiming an indigenous identity has increasingly become a way that groups can obtain new rights that both sort of allow them to promote alternative forms of development in some cases, but also just ensure the security and survivability of their communities. So I think that's really interesting. It's something I would like to look at more in future work, whether these incentives actually promote groups seeking indigenous rights. One thing that we see in Bolivia is that many groups have not pursued indigenous rights, specifically under the 2009 Constitution, because of all the new responsibilities that governments have to take on if they become autonomous. Specifically, they have to fund their own activities in ways that, before they could rely on intergovernmental transfers or municipal government to collect local revenue, but autonomous governments have to do all of that themselves and often don't have prior experience doing some of that. So that's one reason that some communities have been hesitant to adopt indigenous rights. So they can offer new benefits. They can also, introduce new costs for communities too.
Okay, a couple more questions from the audience. First one is from June. And she asks, based on your surveys or other research, whether you know of any relationship between, whether there's a role of indigenous language versus bilingualism versus Spanish language dominance in shaping preference for indigenous or peasant rights. So does language matter, and in what way? Second question from somebody who identified himself as a tar heel from North Carolina, asked you to speak a little bit more to the tensions and difficulties in infusing demand. You touched on this a little bit to the end of your talk, but how compatible are peasant indigenous demands? Where are the key points of tension? What role, getting back, sorry to bring up parties again, but this is where Santi and my brains are. What role do parties play potentially in infusing demands? And what relevance do you see to contemporary conflict? Santiago mentioned the relatively recent Tipnis conflict in Bolivia, where it's proven difficult to juggle these two. So speak a little bit more to the tensions and different ways of tensions in infusing demands, different ways of overcoming those tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for these questions. In terms of bilingualism and indigenous language, one thing that I do find, and I'm not sure whether, which way the sort of causal arrow goes on, is it the indigenous rights that promote the preservation of indigenous languages, or is it the indigenous languages that promote the indigenous rights? But I do see a strong correlation between monolingual indigenous communities and indigenous rights on the one hand, as well as bilingual indigenous communities and indigenous rights. And actually the relationship is even stronger for bilingual indigenous communities. Now that might be the case because those communities that speak Spanish very well and have spoken Spanish for a long time might be better able to demand rights and to exercise those rights effectively. And that might be the case. I mean, that's sort of my expectation from my fieldwork and sort of just logically what I think is happening. Whereas monolingual Spanish communities are often the ones that seek sort of peasant rights. And, if we take it sort of a level of abstraction, higher individual rights, which don't necessarily map on well to indigenous rights. And those are the same communities where we see more indicators of assimilation than sort of what I've in other work called accommodation. So I think that's a great point and a really interesting idea that I want to engage a little bit more with, because I do think this is sort of a reinforcing thing. And in terms of this idea of the tension and the difficulties in fusing demands, absolutely, it's something that in the cases that I study has been really sort of an active point of contention, because it can take sort of, two forms in what I've seen. So at the level of a union, a fused demand could be, we advocate for communal land holding, political autonomy of local community leaders, and also better working conditions, shorter working days, better pay. In other cases, there's sort of, it depends on the community approach, where communal land is an option, but also private land should be an option too for communities that want that. So some unions actually say, we need a land reform that allows communities to decide whether they want to operate the land they're assigned as either private parcels or communal land. That's one way of sort of addressing the difficulties. Now, another layer of complexity that can emerge through these fused demands is that certain demands further empower Indigenous leaders, perhaps at the expense of union leaders. And sometimes that's been a point of contention too within organizations, which is that union leaders are not eager to empower further these potential competing sources of mobilization. But it's precisely in the areas where Indigenous leaders can say, okay, well, but we have a lot of collective action capacity. If you choose not to mobilize with us, we will mobilize independently through an Indigenous organization with other communities in our province. That Indigenous leaders have actually been able to sort of push union demands towards not just peasant rights, but also ethnic Indigenous rights. And parties have traditionally, in response to Steve's point on this, parties, the parties that I've looked at so far have had sort of, at least throughout most of the 20th century, have been not useful in helping facilitate fused demands. So generally, they were the ones that were much more eager, either through leftist or corporatist parties, were much more eager to say, no, there's a peasant identity. Their peasant rights, Indigenous rights are not really the way that groups should be, sort of addressed or mobilized around. They were viewed as sort of areas of division within a larger sort of movement or ideology, which was sometimes based around class, sometimes based around sort of just a populist project. And therefore, the parties have been sort of, I think, a barrier to fused demands. Unions have been much more sort of innovative in that way, I think, than parties, and open to fused demands as a way of mobilization, just out of sort of basic necessity, I think. But I think that it's an interesting question to look at. And it may have, I haven't looked as much at contemporary parties, but it may be now that, sort of international Indigenous movements have created a language that there's much more sort of fusion that the parties are doing at this point between sort of workers' demands and Indigenous demands. There's certainly some sort of anecdotal evidence of that, but I haven't looked at it systematically.
My turn? Okay. This is great. So I've got one question from the audience about urbanization, which is a little bit different from the question I had about urbanization. So why don't we just label this urbanization? I'll give you two questions. Jose Carlos Fernandez asks whether or not the encroachment of urbanization on communal land has been a factor in the embrace of Indigenous rights. I mean, we can think about that. I guess I had another question, and that was whether or not over time, we know that Latin America has become more urban over the course of the last 50 years. Some countries we have, 90%, this may not be true in Bolivia, but in some countries we've got 85, 90%. This isn't just Uruguay. We've got a large urban population. Presumably people are emptying from the countryside in lots of places. What is that doing to the nature, the cohesion of Indigenous communities, to how Indigenous communities view cities? Do they have children in cities? Do they have grandchildren in cities? So we're all kind of interested in how the process of urbanization plays into the story. This is not just a static story of rural communities versus the state and rich rural people. I guess the second question that I want to ask is my question, to be frank, and it's a bit broader. And that is, how do we think about your argument outside of Peru and Bolivia? You mentioned Mexico once, and I'm not as expert in this, obviously, as you are, but I'm just trying to think about the central strands of your argument and how they would play out. When I'm thinking about private landowners grabbing lands, I mean, I think about the sugar estates of Morelos, and I think about how this fuels Zapata's movement and the Mexican Revolution, really. The church, because you were dealing with independent Latin America, you didn't bring up what happens when the church is stripped of its land in many countries, including Mexico. This sets off the scramble for land. Well, does your argument hold up if we think about Morelos today versus Oaxaca, where I think about indigenous usos y costumbres as being stronger than in Morelos? So I'm not an expert on regional indigenous communities in Mexico, but I'm kind of curious about how do we take this story, which is a story about basically the center of the Incan Empire, and how do we think about indigenous communities? How do we think about Mapuche communities? How do we think about indigenous communities in the northwest provinces of Argentina? How do we think about more peripheral indigenous communities that were not at the center of the Incan Empire? So did your argument walk us through that? And maybe I'll just tack on one more. You can never ask enough questions from Santiago. Santi asks also about, let's walk through your argument. Let's go back to the beginning and tell us how the limited demand for indigenous rights, how do your arguments play out in the limited demand for indigenous rights that we see in the case of indigenous autonomy in Bolivia? You raise this intriguing question at the beginning. Walk us through how this happens. Okay, I'll stop there. We might have some time to hear from me again. If not, I'm sure you've heard from me enough today.
No, never. This was great. These are great questions. In terms of the first around urbanization, I think we can think of cities and urbanization generally as sort of a paradox for indigenous communities. On the one hand, it's sort of the key existential threat is that there's this potential source that is sort of drawing people out of the community and eroding their population base. On the other hand, cities have been a key sort of source of financial viability of communities too. Now, why is that the case? In many indigenous communities in Mexico or Peru, one of the key ways that sort of local positions are filled is through a cargo system, where individuals rotate for between 7 and 12 months in positions of sort of community responsibility. And when people can't fulfill that responsibility, they either pay a fine or they come back and do their work. And if they don't do either, they lose their access to communal land, and their family might lose access to their communal land. So when I talk to some of my friends in Cusco who are from indigenous communities, they said, who are from the city of Cusco, who are from indigenous communities, they would say, they call me every year for the cargo, and they charge me a big fine, because that's the way the community is funded at this point, because the people that have made it out and have better economic opportunities are functionally providing money to the community to keep it financially viable. And there's evidence of this happening in Mexico too, with immigrants to the United States who are being, charged sometimes as much as $8,000, $10,000 a year by their communities for not fulfilling their cargo responsibilities. And these people keep getting called because they have the financial means, or at least perceive to have the financial means to pay. So it's difficult. When I talk to community leaders, they always said, what we want is a form of sort of, well, the first thing they would always say, and they're both related points, is please tell your friends when you go home to come here and visit us. And because everyone sort of was interested in sort of tourism because it's a way that the community can be economically viable over the long term. And one community leader basically told me, he said, if we don't have some form of economic activity to keep people in the community is just going to disappear. There are too many other alternatives. And many of, obviously, it's often the younger population that's most likely to leave. So cities are, at once a threat, and I would say more of a threat than a blessing, but they also provide these unexpected sort of financial opportunities for Indigenous communities that I think are important. In terms of cities actually sort of consuming communal land, I don't see that as much. One interesting thing that happens, though, is that many communities sort of transplant from a rural area into an urban area. So they move from a rural community to a neighborhood on the outskirts of a city, and all are together. They continue to maintain many of the same institutions that they had in rural communities, but of course with some distinctions, because now many of the community members are located in a city rather than the countryside. But these linkages between rural and urban areas don't just sort of evaporate once people move to cities. In terms of where the sort of central strands of the argument might hold, I think in many ways we can look at Oaxaca, and maybe another useful comparison state is Yucatan. Both have sort of high indigenous populations. Oaxaca traditionally had very few haciendas just because of poor quality land. So it actually had a higher indigenous population because there weren't many non-indigenous Spaniards who wanted to settle there because the land was pretty low quality. Yucatan, however, had much more complicated dynamics, and much more sort of especially the forest land of many of the indigenous communities was highly desirable to the non-indigenous population. There were more conflicts, more sort of land expropriation. And we see in Yucatan a higher percentage of unions mobilizing. And we don't see the same emergence of indigenous rights in Yucatan that we see in Oaxaca, for example. I mean, one of the really interesting things about Oaxaca is you say, well, why does Oaxaca have so many municipalities, have so many more municipalities than everywhere else? I think Mexico has maybe 2,500 municipalities, and Oaxaca has almost 600. Well, it's because the indigenous communities in the late 19th century fought to get municipalities that corresponded to the borders of indigenous communities so that the municipalities would reflect the underlying community structure. So even in the initial establishment of municipalities, we see this sort of early emergence of indigenous rights, even in Yucatan. So I think, and thinking about the case of Bolivia and how this argument might travel to Bolivia, in the same way that there was Conscription Vial, the road conscription program in Peru, there was Prestación Vial in Bolivia. And one of the things that I look at is I trace over time whether or not the exposure to the Prestación Vial and loss of land to haciendas has predicted whether or not communities have at least expressed interest and held an initial vote on autonomy, because there's so few that have actually adopted. We can look at those that have actually begun sort of an application for autonomy to understand how these different factors might shape the decision to pursue these indigenous rights. And the survey results, I think, are even more interesting in that regard. And we can talk about those more, but I don't want to keep blathering on if there's more questions.
We'll ask a question. So, as you know, Chris, there's not a ton of political science work on indigenous mobilization, indigenous demand making in early 20th century Latin America. In fact, most of us political scientists sort of think that indigenous mobilization started in the 1970s. And that's one of the really interesting things about your work. But one reason why it's surprising to many of us that there was so much indigenous demand making in the late 19th, early 20th century, you just pointed to the high impact demand making in Oaxaca and in Mexico, is the threat of repression and fear. And there are real cases, and I can imagine there are many that I'm unaware of really heavy repression of indigenous mobilization, indigenous communities in early 20th century Latin America. Just El Salvador in 1932 is one case. So one of the questions from the audience was, is it ever the case, and under what conditions does fear or threat of violence prevent indigenous communities from making demands?
Yeah, I think this is a a very good question, and part of the interesting sort of, long-term trajectory of the story, and that demand sort of oscillate between sort of being latent in periods in which demand making could be punished with repression or violence, and becoming activated when the opportunity space emerges that's more amenable to making demand. So I think that it's certainly true that during times of sort of repression and military governance, or sort of even worse, sort of extermination or genocide of indigenous communities, that we're less likely to see demand making occur, but often the structures remain as long as communities aren't completely destroyed in order to facilitate demand making once the opportunity space emerges in the future. But it's certainly true that particularly severe periods of repression can be really harmful to communities. One interesting thing to note about the periods of resistance to labor conscription is that those never worked. Labor conscription wasn't ended in response to resistance to it. All of those resistance movements were eventually repressed by the government, or by normally provincial governments and provincial police in the case of Peru. However, even though they were repressed and not successful in stopping conscription, they sort of laid the later foundation for long-term mobilization for indigenous rights, often not violently, as resistance and indigenous rebellion often was in the 1920s, but in more sort of peaceful ways through traditional institutional channels, normally through these organizations and institutions that were formed. So I think that that's the idea of fear and threat is certainly really important in the argument. And I think that, especially being really careful in the book, and something I'm trying to do, but need to be more careful of, about sort of addressing these sort of periods of latency and how demand making persisted even in contexts that were not favorable to indigenous groups making demands, and why those structures and institutions persisted almost underground is useful to discuss. And I need to do much more to address that, but I think that's functionally the way it worked.
I'm gonna let Fran hit clean up here.
I always love when he says I can hit cleanup. So just a very quick follow-up on this question about repression. I thought that was also a really interesting question, repression of indigenous communities. But what if we broadened the scope of this and didn't think simply about repression, but thought about coercion, or even the kinds of incentives that state actors or party entrepreneurs might hold out to indigenous communities? In addition to brutal repression, there's also the carrot and the stick of, if your community votes and delivers votes to the PRI, then maybe we'll give you a few miserable land titles, or we'll send some piped water your way, or something. I mean, we'll do something for your community, and if you don't do what we want, then we won't. So how do we think about the kinds of incentive? So we got, just the last couple of remaining questions that we have are about how what holds indigenous communities together, what makes them indigenous, what makes them distinct, what do communities want? June was asking, do they want development? Do they want, you were telling the very interesting story about the young people in the communities wanting tourism. So when we think about how these communities can leverage what they have, that one thing they have now is international public opinion on their side in a way that has not been true in 400 years. Or at least some international public opinion. How do they weigh this moment when they might press for rights versus they might use the threat of exercising those rights in order to gain concessions? And so maybe I'll just let you have the last word on that question, and then you and I can talk about your poll results some other time.
Great. Perfect. In terms of, is there a sort of exchange of indigenous rights for votes, or, that's something that's super interesting, and something that, there's definitely evidence. I've actually got a paper with Madai on this, about sort of the exchange of votes for development programs in indigenous communities that reinforced traditional institutions in the 1960s. And I think that, there's some evidence of that, but in terms of indigenous rights, I haven't seen that so much. That was the really interesting thing that happened with the Indian tribute, right? That there were these sort of groups would pay the government basically, but this was money instead of votes, in exchange for the government not allowing rural actors or the government itself not attacking indigenous lands and undermining indigenous political authority. So there were these sort of pacts that emerged really clearly during the colonial and post-independence period. But there's not evidence that I have found, at least, and I will keep looking for it, of these sort of electoral pacts emerging in quite this way between, presidents and individual indigenous communities, especially after indigenous groups gained the franchise in the 20th century. But I need to look at that and see whether that might be happening or not. I just haven't found evidence yet. In terms of what makes a community indigenous, and this is a fundamental question in many ways to my book, because one of the things that I'm arguing is that indigenous communities are sort of becoming less indigenous in some ways and more peasant in some cases, right? But I think what I'm sort of trying to understand are these communities that at least started out as indigenous communities at the beginning of the 20th century and tracing what they look like today and understanding sort of the evolution of indigenous communities. And I'm drawing a lot in my language of indigenous from the Marisol de la Cadena definition, which is that indigenous groups are the putative descendants of the pre-colonial civilizations in the Americas. And I think that's a nice definition because in using the word putative, she's arguing in some ways, at least implicitly, that this is a negotiated concept, that what is indigenous isn't just sort of self-identification, also depends on governments recognizing communities as being indigenous. So there's this contested idea of what indigenous is in many cases. So I'm using that definition. What do communities want? That's one of the things that I want to highlight most, is that communities want very different things. I think at the end of the day, most communities want, if this is sort of my personal interpretation more than the professional interpretation, which is most want a better life for their children at the end of the day. Most of the community members that I've spoken with, that's their primary goal. And the idea of cultures and institutions as strategic or having expressive value is important, but the more important thing is that the children have a better possibility than they did. And they, of course, want their children close. So the best opportunity for that would be for the community to stay together, right? So I do think that there's also, a really clear idea that most indigenous community members want their communities to stay together. But beyond that, I think questions of whether that's better done by integrating more into markets or remaining sort of traditional forms of economic activity, I think that's, sort of one up to individuals and also sort of an open question for many indigenous community members. One of the things that's sort of interesting about these initial mobilizations by unions or indigenous leaders is that many community members at the beginning of the 20th century weren't sure what rights they could demand. And so they were so dependent on these sort of intermediaries, whether it was the community leader or union representatives, to communicate what rights are even possible for us to demand that the government might actually recognize, and what rights can we claim as people. And I think that was so important in transforming the nature of communities. But even within communities, there's enormous heterogeneity in what people want, of course, because at the end of the day, communities are collective units, but they're comprised of individuals, and not all community members think the same way as their neighbors do. So that's really important to think about. And in terms of the role of sort of international public opinion and shifting, I mean, it's sort of interesting that we do see indigenous rights emerge in periods where opinion leaders or, opinion more generally favors the emergence of these rights. And as Steve, going back to Steve's comment earlier about, we associate indigenous rights with emerging in the 1970s, but in Peru, for example, in the 1920s, there was a robust conversation in Lima among the intellectuals around what it meant to have an indigenous population with indigenous rights, which ultimately looked in a lot of the rhetoric like the sort of fused demand approach that I'm I'm highlighting here. But there was a lot of language around the importance of ethnicity and acknowledging indigenous populations, and a lot of the sort of intellectuals who moved from Puno and Cusco to Lima and became sort of dominant figures in the intellectual scene in Lima in the 1920s had very strong ideas of what it meant to be indigenous and what indigenous rights specifically meant. And Leguía, one of the reasons he offered communal land was initially he thought it was a good idea to ally with these intellectuals and to embrace indigenous rights, but quickly realized it would alienate his base of rural elites, and then began to, undermine and repress all of these organizations that were advocating for indigenous rights, including the Tawantinsuyo Committee. So, but yeah, it is these periods of opinion and international opinion, even domestic opinion, are really important and conducive to the emergence of indigenous rights, for sure.
Thanks. I need to close. Thanks to our interpreters, Romy and Paula. Thanks to Pao and Jill, and to Fran, but thanks especially to Chris Carter for a wonderful presentation and discussion. And we look forward to having you back when the book is out. Just as a reminder, next week we have a special event on governing Latin American cities with Rio de Janeiro Mayor Eduardo Paez. That'll be moderated by our own Alicia Holland. So join us next week. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.